Are there any senators who have not yet voted or wish to change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 83, the nays are 8. The nomination is confirmed. The question is now on the Forrest nomination. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, motions to reconsider are considered made and laid on the table. The President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action. The Senate will resume legislative session.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
I now ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to period of morning business. Senators be allowed to speak for up to 10 minutes each during that time.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
From Illinois.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to proceed as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, with regard to our policy towards Iran and the recent revelation of a potential attack involving not just foreign embassies and ambassadors, but Americans, potentially senators, being killed by a plot hatched by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Quds Force, there should be consequences, not just concerns, expressed from the administration. We have witnessed a growing aggressiveness by the Iranian regime towards the United States and towards their own people. For example, recently, an Iranian actress who appeared uncovered in an Australian film was then sentenced to 90 lashes for her so-called crime. With regard to the 330,000 Baha'is, a religious minority in Iran, first, they were excluded from all public contracting. Then they were told all of their children had to leave Iranian universities. And then all of their home addresses were registered in secret by the Iranian Interior Ministry. I would suggest that we have seen this movie before in a different decade wearing different uniforms. But this is the bureaucracy necessary to carry out a Kristallnacht in Farsi. We have seen, for example, the Persian world's first blogger, Hussein Renagi, thrown into jail simply for expressing tolerance towards other peoples and other religions. And probably most emblematic, we saw the jailing of Nasrin Sotoudeh, a young mother and a lawyer whose sole crime was to represent Shireen Ebadi, a Nobel Prize winner, in the courts of Iran. We hear and have watched unclassified reports of an acceleration of uranium enrichment in Iran. We even have the irony, according to the International Monetary Fund, that despite comprehensive United Nations and U.S. sanctions, according to the IMF, Iran had greater economic growth last year than the United States, and that the Iranian indebtedness is only a fraction of U.S. indebtedness. According to the IMF, the United States owes about 70% of its GDP in debt held by the public. For Iran, only 5.5%. Now, the United States has enacted a new round of sanctions against Iran. President Obama signed it into law last year, 410 votes in the House, unanimous in the Senate. I worked for many years on a predecessor to that legislation when I was a member of the House. The record of the administration, and especially our very able Undersecretary of the Treasury, David Cohen, has been very good at implementing that bill. He has been very successful in reducing formal banking contacts between American, European, and Asian banks and Iran. But it's very important when we look at the situation of how to deal with Iran that we not see it from Washington's view looking towards Iran, in which you see an awful lot of banks and an awful lot of transactions shut down. But you look at it from Tehran's view looking back at the United States, And there you will see a very quickly growing Iranian economy, a growing record of brazen oppression, actresses sentenced to 90 lashes, Nobel Prize-winning attorneys thrown in jail, an accelerating nuclear program, and then a decision by the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Force, Quds Force, to attack the United States. Long ago, I thought that it was a mistake to have the Drug Enforcement Agency left outside of the U.S. intelligence community. Luckily, we reversed that decision and we brought DEA back into the intelligence community. It was a lucky strike that the person who was contacted by the Quds Force to carry out an attack on the United States actually contacted a confidential informant working for the DEA. It was in that lucky break that we had the ability to break this plot. But if you read Attorney General Holder's complaint against the defendant involved, you will see, I believe it is on page 12, a rendition of how, if you could not kill the ambassador outside the restaurant, it was perfectly okay with the Quds Force operator that a bomb go off involving dozens, if not over 100 Americans killed. The bonus, he thought, that maybe a large number of senators would be involved, and if that was necessary to kill this ambassador, all the better. Now, the Treasury Department has designated, finally, the head of the Quds Force under our law. But it is ironic that when you look at the comprehensive record of designations, the Europeans, who actually are not known for their strong-willed backbone on many international questions, have had a far more far-reaching effect on calling it the way they see it in Iran. Both Europe and America now have a regime to bring forward sanctions and designations against Iranians who are, quote, comprehensive abusers of human rights. But currently, our government has only designated 11 Iranians, where the European Union has designated over 60. One of the people missed by our administration is the president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who often talks about ending the state of Israel. Probably the only head of state of a member of the United Nations who regularly talks about erasing another member of the United Nations from the planet. We also haven't designated President Ahmadinejad's chief of staff. We haven't designated dozens of people that even the European Union has designated as comprehensive abusers of human rights. So what should we do when we've uncovered a plot to attack the United States in which the highest levels of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Quds Force was involved? Well, thank goodness for the DEA and then the rest of the law enforcement intelligence community of the United States, the plot was foiled. And so no attack was carried out. In my mind, we should take the toughest action possible short of military action. And is there consensus in the Congress behind what that action should be? I would argue yes. Senator Schumer and I, this summer, put forward what we feel is one of the real, most crippling sanctions the United States could deliver against Iran. And that is to ensure that any financial institution that has any contact with the central bank of Iran be excluded from the U.S. market. Because the United States is the largest economy on earth, we believe that nearly every financial institution on the planet will cut its ties to the central bank of Iran. That most likely would cripple Iran's currency and cause chaos within their economy. You know what? Iran might actually even suffer a recession, which it currently is not in. And I think that would be an appropriate price to pay. When Senator Schumer and I reached out to the Senate to ask for support, I was very surprised at the answer, because all but 8 senators signed our letter. 92 Republicans and Democrats signed the letter, stating that it should be the policy of the United States to collapse the central bank of Iran, to cripple its currency. And after what we learned this week of a plot to kill Americans and to carry out terrorist attacks in the capital city of the United States, I think that represents appropriate consequences not just concerns. We heard from the administration this morning, and while I was encouraged by the diligent work, especially of the Treasury Department, I was concerned about another thing. There are press reports that the administration learned about this plot in June and only revealed it to us the day before yesterday. So the administration has had months to understand what this plot meant and plan for the consequences. And yet, except for minor actions against a small airline in Iran called Mahan Airways, except for actually finally designating the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force, we have no comprehensive action by the United States. My recommendation to this House and to the administration is you should take yes for an answer. With 92 Republicans and Democrats all standing behind an effort to collapse the central bank of Iran, this is the appropriate sanction. On top of that, we have the Menendez bipartisan legislation to close loopholes in the sanctions, already co-sponsored by 76 senators. This is a tough time of partisanship in Washington. You don't get bipartisan issues like this that often. I am surprised that, having known about this plot since June, the administration hasn't already put forward action. But I would urge them to do so. This was not a multilateral attack by a collection of countries on the United States. And therefore, I don't think that we should wait for multilateral approval before the United States acts against the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and the highest levels of the Iranian government. We should designate the full list of comprehensive abusers of human rights, the way the EU has done. We should exclude any financial institution from the United States that does business with the Central Bank of Iran. And we should make sure that in the case of high-level Iranian officials that have plotted an attack, potentially involving dozens of American deaths right here in the capital city of the United States, there should be severe consequences. They should be fairly swift. And we should not be mistaken our inaction for weakness in the face of what is one of the most brazen international acts we've seen in recent times. So with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Well, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent. I'll be recognized for up to 20 minutes as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Let me just make one comment. The senator from Illinois I'm glad he said what he did. It is very significant, and people don't look at Iran as seriously as they should. You know, it's not even classified that Iran is going to have the capability of having a weapon of mass destruction, a nuclear warhead, and a delivery system by 2015. That was the very reason that they were going to have a ground-based interceptor in Poland so that we could defend against something coming from that direction, since all of our ground-based interceptors were on the west coast, Alaska, and Southern California. So I think when we see things like this, in the fact that they're coming out and doing things that they haven't done before, to me, that just tells me that our expectations of their capability, nuclear capability, are very true, and it's a very serious thing. That's not what I want to talk about, Mr. President. In the wake of the defeat of President Obama's jobs bill, I want to give a couple of thoughts here and then talk about something we better look out for in the future. That jobs bill failed by a large margin. And we heard the President say, you know, pass the bill, pass the bill, pass the bill. Well, we didn't pass the bill. And I can see why the President wants to consider passing some kind of a jobs bill right away when you stop and remember what he did with the last one. The last stimulus bill was $825 billion. And this package was rammed through the Congress shortly after he entered office. The Recovery Act, as it was called, included only about $27.5 billion. Now, out of approximately $825 billion, only $27 billion for roads and highways. The occupier of the chair is very well aware of my concern over infrastructure in America. And I remember when that bill was on the floor, And Senator Boxer from California and I had an amendment to increase that amount. It's only 3% of the total of $825 billion would go to roads, highways, maintenance, bridges, and this type of thing. Only 3%. We were trying to raise that up to 30%. Now, if that had happened, then just look at where we would be today. We would have the jobs. We had all the shovel-ready jobs throughout America. Certainly in my state of Oklahoma, our portion of that would have been well spent, just distributed in the way that we had the formula in the after the 2005 highway reauthorization bill. Anyway, that actually was only 3%. It was only $27 billion out of $825 billion. Well, the one that we just defeated was a $447 billion stimulus bill, and it only had $27 billion in roads, highways, construction, maintenance, the things that really provide jobs, the things that this country needs. You know, I've been ranked as the most conservative member of the United States Senate several different times in the past, and yet I readily say that I'm a big spender in two areas. One, national defense, and the other in infrastructure. And I think that's what we're supposed to be doing here. And we are just a desperate situation with our infrastructure around the country. So you might say, well, if the President had the $825 billion stimulus package and only $27.5 billion went to roads and highways, you know, what happened to the rest of it? Well, the rest of it, in spite of what he said, and I'm going to read what he said right after the passage of the bill, and when he was signing the bill, the $825 billion stimulus bill, he said, and I'm quoting now, "What I'm signing then is a balanced plan with a mix of tax cuts and investments. It's a plan that's been put together without earmarks or the usual pork barrel spending. It's a plan that will be implemented at an unprecedented level of transparency and accountability." Well, that's, you know, you stop and remember that, as I tell you what this actually went for. It's clear that the most recent example was this loan guarantee with Solyndra. Everyone in here is aware of what happened with Solyndra. They know that it was a firm that was producing supposedly green energy. We know that the people that were behind this loan guarantee of $535 million were big contributors to the administration. And they went ahead and were able to get not bailed out, but get their loan guaranteed, costing the taxpayers $500 million. And that was part of what was in this bill. That's where the money was. The genesis of that was the $825 billion stimulus bill. Now, I'm reminiscent a little bit of what happened back in the middle 90s, back when Bill Clinton was President of the United States. We had a very similar thing happen at that time. There's a company called the Loral Corporation. The Loral Corporation is headed up by Bernard Swartz. Bernard Swartz was one of the biggest contributors of the Democrat National Party and of Bill Clinton. Well, Bernard Swartz was, their company, the Loral Corporation, built a guidance system for a missile, so that missile could be more accurate. Now, because of some of the obvious reasons, even though China wanted to have that system so they would be able to guide their missiles more accurately for obvious reasons, we didn't want them to have it. And so it took a waiver signed by the President of the United States. President Bill Clinton did it. He signed the waiver, and they got the money. I see similarities in here, and I think, again, everyone is familiar with that. Now, how did they get the money? Where did it come from? The $825 billion in the stimulus bill. So let's just look, since the President gave that statement, which I will read again. He said, what I'm signing then is a balanced plan with a mix of tax cuts and investments. It's a plan that has been put together without earmarks, without the usual pork barrel spending. Well, what do you call the Solyndra thing? That's pork barrel spending. But what about what about the earmarks? You know, this is really a confusing thing for most people, because my well-meaning conservative friends in the House of Representatives a couple of years ago put a one-year moratorium on earmarks, and earmarks would be defined, of course, as appropriations or authorizations. Now, by doing that, that totally contradicts what the Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, says what we're supposed to be doing here. It says we are supposed to be doing the appropriations, we're supposed to be doing the authorization. That is specifically precluded from the President in the article in his article in the Constitution. So it's one that was very, very obvious. Now, we find out later that the person who was behind that was none other than President Obama. And there's a reason for this, because most people don't understand there are two different kinds of earmarks. One is congressional earmarks. That's what a congressman will put on. A lot of the times in the dark at night, they'll try to put something down that maybe is not in the best interest of the United States, but helps his district. That occasionally happens. It shouldn't happen, and under our system, it won't happen if you require all appropriations to be authorized. But the other kind, in addition to the congressional earmarks, are bureaucratic earmarks. That's what the President can do. So I'll give you an example. I'm on the Armed Services Committee. In the Armed Services Committee, the President's budget comes out. He says what we should spend money on to defend America. Well, a couple of years ago, before this moratorium that the Republicans put on in the House, one of the lines that he had in his budget was $330 million for a launching system. It's called a bucket of rockets. It was a good system, and I would like to have that system for defending America. But we thought in our committee that same $330 million would be better spent on buying 6 new F/A-18E and F model strike fighters for our Air Force. Well, we could do that, except that would be called an earmark. Now, when you destroy an earmark, you don't save any money. You just say, Mr. President, we're not going to do it, so you go ahead and you do this. So consequently, we were able to take the $330 million and put it into the 6 F/A-18s, but after that thing would have passed, that would be called an earmark, and so the President would have all of the power. And if you look back at the $825 billion stimulus bill, look at some of the things that were in there. And he said he wasn't going to have any earmarks. These are presidential earmarks, Madam President. $219,000 to study the hookup behavior of female college co-eds in New York. $1.1 million to pay for beautification of Los Angeles Sunset Boulevard. $10,000 to study whether mice become disoriented when they consume alcohol in Florida. The $712,000 to develop machine-generated humor in Illinois. $259,000 for foreign bus wheel polishers in California, and it goes on and on. $150,000 Massachusetts middle school to build a solar array system on their roof. $1 million to do research on fossils in Argentina. And here's a good one. I don't attribute this to my two good friends who are senators from Wyoming, but it's a $1.2 million to build an underpass for deer in Wyoming. Now, that's what the President put in. Those are all earmarks. And so, consequently, I think what we're trying to get to here is, if he had been successful in the $447 billion stimulus bill just earlier this week, then we could anticipate the same type of thing happening. And I really want the conservatives in America to wake up to the fact that the problems we have, when they talk about earmarks, are not congressional earmarks, they are bureaucratic earmarks. It wasn't long ago that Sean Hannity, on his show, had a feature. I think it took him several nights to do it. It was the 102 most egregious earmarks. And he named all these earmarks one after another and went on and on and on. And I came down to the Senate floor the morning after that, and I read that same list. There were 102 earmarks very similar to what I just read. And the interesting thing about it, and I said this on the Senate floor at that time, what did all these 102 earmarks have in common? Not one was a congressional earmark. They're all bureaucratic earmarks. Now, we are going to be attempting to do something about this, because it's something that almost everyone would agree needs to be done. Now, what we're going to introduce, and what I have a bill that I'm working on now, and I'm gathering some co-sponsors, it's legislation that will bring real transparency and accountability to this process. And it would do this by involving Congress in the grant-making process. Right now, agencies are required to disclose a lot of information about grant awards, but not until after they're already awarded. We don't know about them, and we even here in this chamber don't know about them until some unelected bureaucrat actually makes these what I would refer to as bureaucratic earmarks. So it's setting up a system very similar to the Congressional Review Act. The Congressional Review Act lets us look at the regulations and have a process by which we can stop the bureaucrats from passing regulations that we may think, as elected members, elected by the people, is not good. And this that would do essentially the same thing that the CRA does for regulations, it would do for these earmarks. So it's something that we'll be active in, and I think back now, if we had not defeated that $447 billion stimulus bill the first part of this week, we'd be looking right now, and I'm sure they'd be putting together their list of earmarks. So I think we have an opportunity now to do two things. Well, number one, when the President, and I say when and not if, when the President comes up with another jobs bill, let's look at it very carefully to make sure that we have everything specifically in there if it's going to be deserving of our votes. And I say that to each individual, Democrat and Republican in this chamber. And then the second thing, make sure that we don't open the door for him to be able to come up with another several $100 billion of earmarks as we did in the $825 billion stimulus bill 2 years ago. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Madam President, I ask that the quorum call in progress be vitiated.
Without objection.
Madam President, there are no one seeking time right now, even though I've used my time. I ask unanimous consent to be recognized again for up to 10 minutes.
Without objection.
Madam President, I heard a report today from Senator Murkowski from Alaska. Apparently, the Energy Committee had a hearing on the 90-day shale gas report. And I think this is very significant. I don't want to, I'm sure she'll come down and talk about it in detail. I didn't even know about it until at noon today when she gave a report, and I happened to be there. But it is something that's very, very significant, because in this country, when we're talking about energy and the fact that we have enough energy that we produce domestically, we can produce domestically in the United States of America, to run this country on for 100 years in terms of gas at the present consumption, or 50 years at the as far as oil is concerned, and we are dependent upon oil, gas, and coal to run this country. Those are fossil fuels. And there are a lot of people who are saying we have to do away with fossil fuels. And every time I hear people say, it's kind of laughable, they say, well, we have to do something about our dependence upon foreign oil by doing away with our own production in this country. You know, our problem isn't that we don't have the amount of coal, oil, and gas that we need to be totally independent from anybody. We do. But we have politically, we have the obstacles. There's not one other country in the world where the politicians won't let that country develop its own resources, except for the United States of America. It's kind of interesting, it wasn't too long ago when the President Obama, who's very much in line with some of the far-left environmentalists who want to do away with fossil fuels, he was realizing that the people were catching on. And people knew that with all the shale deposits that are out there and all the every week that goes by, we find another great big opportunity for shale. This is both oil and gas. And the President said, well, you know, gas is plentiful and we need to use more gas and all that. But at the end of his speech, he said we have to do something about that procedure called hydraulic fracturing. Well, now, anyone knows who understands energy, that to get at all of these deposits, these shale deposits of gas or oil, you have to use a procedure called hydraulic fracturing. Now, it happens that we know something about it in my state of Oklahoma because in 1948, the first well was fracked, and we have not had one documented case in 60 years of groundwater contamination as a result of hydraulic fracturing. So it's something that does work. But those individuals who want to make people think that they are wanting us to develop our own resources, then they turn around and say we're going to stop or have the federal government regulate hydraulic fracturing. It's totally inconsistent, and I think it's a direct effort to misinform the people. So this meeting that went today, Senator Murkowski did a handout, and I'm going to read a couple of the quotes from some of the people who were testifying. Now, keep in mind, this is after a 90-day shale gas report, and they talked about hydraulic fracturing and all that. One was Dr. Daniel Yergin, who's the chairman of the IHS Cambridge Energy Research Associate, and he's a best-selling author. And he said, quote, "There is a gap in perception. This idea that oil and gas is not regulated. We are all impressed by the quality and the focus, the long experience of the states in regulating oil and gas. There's a strong backbone to it, and that is not as well recognized as in some circles. So I think there is a very strong fabric here." Here's a quote. This is from Kathleen McGinty, and I remember her when she was an aide to Al Gore, and she's now the chairman of the Council of the Environmental Quality. It was during the Clinton administration. And I'm going to quote this right now. She said, "We didn't come up with any conclusions." This is the 90-day shale report. "We didn't come up with any conclusions that the deck chairs need to be shuffled around. There was nothing in the testimony that we heard or in the substance that we focused on or in the what, in quotes, needed to be done that led to a glaring conclusion that there was an actor missing from the scene." Well, this is someone who comes from the completely the other side. So I think it's very important that the more time that you look at this thing, the more there is an awareness of the people that is heightened almost on a daily basis, that we have all this opportunity, and we're not doing it just because of the political obstacles. Dr. Stephen Holdridge, he's the department head at the Samuel Roberts Noble Chair and professor of petroleum engineering at Texas A&M. He said, "Local control, local understanding of best practices is really the best way to go. There's nothing broken with the system now." Well, what he's talking about, if you go into we're an oil state, my state of Oklahoma. A lot of our stuff is pretty shallow, and on the other hand, we have in the Anadarko Basin, we have some of the more deep things. But if you look, for 60 years, the states have regulated hydraulic fracturing, and it has worked very well. And it's not one of these one-size-fits-all, because in some states, you get New York and Pennsylvania now, in the Marcellus shale, it's pretty deep. but it's abundant. Well, the regulation there would be different than it would be in my state of Oklahoma or Louisiana or New Mexico or any of the other oil states. So I think that I was really glad to see this come out, and I was glad that Senator Murkowski is now letting people become aware of it, because we have enough oil, gas, and coal to become totally independent if we can just get the obstacles out of the way. And one of the techniques used in being able to recover this, of course, is hydraulic fracturing. And so that's why a lot of the people who are trying to shut down fossil fuels are trying to shut down that process. I had an experience, I wish I could remember the name of the company, but it was in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, during the recess, and I was calling on different people, and there's a young man who started a company. He had been with a larger one. He's making platforms for hydraulic fracturing. Now, a platform is about a fourth the size of this chamber that I'm speaking in right now. It's a very large thing. On the platform they have, so they can hydraulically fracture these wells, they have a very large diesel engine. And a regulation came through, and I wasn't even aware of this until I sat down with him. This was less than a month ago. And he said the regulation was that you can no longer build platforms and use them for hydraulic fracturing unless you have a Tier 4 engine. Well, we went to check, and he was right. There is no Tier 4 engine. It's on the drawing board, but it's not available commercially now. So that's just another way through regulation that they're trying to do away with hydraulic fracturing. So we've got to be on our toes. We've got to have a wake-up call for the American people. If you want to have good, clean, abundant, cheap energy, we've got it right here in the United States of America, and we need to knock down the political obstacles and develop our own resources like everybody else does. With that, I'll yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Madam President, I ask that proceedings of the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to executive session to consider the following nomination. Calendar number 287, that the nomination be confirmed, the motion to reconsider be made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, and that no further motions be in order to the nomination, that any related statements be printed in the record, and that the President be immediately notified at the Senate's action and the Senate then resume legislative session.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that at a time to be determined by the Majority Leader in consultation with the Republican Leader, the Senate proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 78, that there be 4 hours for debate equally divided in the usual form, that upon the use or yielding back of time, the Senate proceed to vote without intervening action or debate on calendar number 78. The motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, that no further motions be in order to the nomination, that any statements related to the nomination be printed in the record, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate then resume legislative session.
Without objection. So ordered.
I thank the Chair and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Majority Floor Leader.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the call of the quorum be terminated.
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent the Senate stand in recess subject to the call of the chair.
Without objection. So ordered.
The Senate has recessed now to allow members to attend a joint meeting with the House to hear remarks from South Korean President Lee Myung-bak, and you can see that speech beginning live at 4 p.m. Eastern